I am C. Michael Smith. I am a clinical psychologist and analytical psychologist practicing in Michigan in the United States, but also in France and Belgium. And I'm also a shamanic healer and teacher practicing in these places. And I'm author of two books, Psychotherapy and the Sacred and Jung and Shamanism in Dialogue. Both these books are equally influenced by shamanism and the traditions of Jungian psychology. And when I wrote them, I was simply creating a platform, a kind of container for my life's work, because it happened at a time where in the United States, hardly anyone but indigenous peoples even knew about the concept of shamanism, and certainly not in psychology. And anytime I had to explain what I was doing, people just really didn't understand it. So these books were written really to help it be understood. And I had the great help of my mentors, Mircea Eliade at the University of Chicago and Robert Moore. And these books were written some 31 years ago, and they are still very much alive for many people. But for me, I have transcended them. It's no longer a dialogue relationship. It's a synthesis of yoga and shamanism for me, and that's where I'm going to speak to you from today. As I see it, the shamanic path, sometimes called the heart path, and the path of individuation are seamlessly one and the same. At least from my own shamanist perspective, that's how I see it. And I see myself and Jung as being psycho-shamanic, and that word itself puts together the two traditions. And Jung underwent a psycho-shamanic initiation, as did I. And I hope to say a little bit more about that as we go along. But I'm going to be discussing primarily the archetype of initiation. I would love to go into detail about Jung's personal experiences, but many people have done that, and I have done it in my book, Jung and Shamanism in Dialogue. There's a chapter on his life and his midlife crisis, his break with Freud, his wounds, and so on. But I'm not going to have time to do that today. I would prefer just to focus on the structure of the process revealed in the Black Books and in the Red Book. And not to a great extent, just enough so you can see the psycho-shamanic core or the archetype of initiation that's operating. When we talk about the archetype of initiation, this is really a Jungian way of looking at what's called the structure of rites of passage, which has a three-phase development. The first begins when there's a kind of disruption in life. One has been living one's ordinary life, happy or not happy, but relatively stably, peacefully or something, and then a big loss happens. Maybe it's a death of a loved one, maybe it's a sickness or serious illness, maybe it's loss of a source of work, income, maybe it's a deep restlessness or a spontaneous awakening or vocation. But whatever it is, it's a cutting off from the everyday life, from the social world and what Jung would call his number one personality and his investment in the persona field. Just a separation from the life you've been living. And you were plunged deep within and are hungering or yearning for some type of help within or without to navigate this difficult time. Let's say you lost someone you loved. You had a divorce or a death of a parent or something like that. So this creates acute pain and a crisis. And so what you're going to be yearning for there is some way to digest that and process it and get the feeling better again, because nothing can feel worse. And so this, in essence, is the call to go deeper into your own feelings, into your memories, into your own unconscious, into the underworld, the land of the dead, if we can put it mythopoetically, and speak the language of myth and folk tales as Jung loved to do. So the first phase is this sense of loss or crisis and a separation from the ordinary everyday life. And suddenly you want the quest for happiness or healing or insight or understanding or a new sense of who you are or a new vision for the next part of your life. So this is the initiatory descent. And one takes a deep journey, hopefully all the way to the center, if one can, and there to find the gold, that vision or insight or sense of mission that you now need so you can bring it back with you into the world. And then there's the return journey, where you're bringing that gift back into the world, or that new healing, or that insight, or that new status, whatever the case may be. And you're able to, once again, engage society, in fact, re-engage society creatively. And with a sense of purpose, or a sense of clarity and understanding. So this is the basic archetypal structure. One must move through these three phases. And you usually need some help from inner guidance, but you also usually need help from some external support, a human figure, a ritual elder, a shaman, a psychoanalyst, a psychotherapist, someone who can be there for you in this deep space that you're in, this place in the underworld, and your journey towards the center, where you can find the gold, the healing, the insight, the vision for your life. And this concept of the archetype of initiation is really based upon the work of Arnold van Gennep, who was a Belgian-based anthropologist looking at rites of passage all over the planet. And he mapped it out into three phases. And then this great mythologist here in the United States, Joseph Campbell, gave them catchy names. The first phase he called separation, meaning separation from the social order, the everyday. And initiation descent, which is the second phase. And the third phase he called return with the moon, or the gold, and to give it to society or your community, so that you have a purpose, something comes out of this deep journey and process that you've been through. So it would seem that mythology is based on this ancient archetypal initiatory structure. And it's no wonder that Jungians find a lot of support for seeing what's happening in the psyche and understanding how to navigate it from mythology and folklore. Because the images there, they bring forth primordial images and principles and themes that help us to understand what otherwise feels like chaos. Now, something else that's needed for rites of passage is access to the sacred energies. Now, for the old peoples of the earth, not just indigenous peoples, but I mean the archaic peoples before history was recorded, there was a view that the life energies were always running down and need to be renewed. Life was lived in cycles and seasons and patterns that repeat themselves. And every tribe, every community had its great ancestors, its heroes that are in their stories, in their mythology, who did certain acts that benefited the world, or the creation of the world, or the survival of the community. And they're held up as archetypes, as ideal standards that are appealed to in rites of initiation, such as puberty rites for young boys and girls who are being transformed into men and women. According to Mircea Eliade, the world itself was seen as running down over time. The more distant in time one gets from the eternal center, the more things tend to decay, grow old, fall apart. And so to keep society, to keep the world alive, the people need to return to the center, the axis mundi. It's like a power source and energy source, to re-plug back into that, to get renewed, to get inspired. Renovatio is renovation, to renew life. And there were lunar cycles, these monthly moon cycles, which were opportunities to do that. The Amerindians in North America have their longhouses, sweat lodges, moon lodges, and other ceremonies at the full moon. And this is very ancient in human history. And there are solar cycles. In fact, one of the themes of Jung's understanding of rites of initiation had to do with times of transition in the life cycle that he saw as solar. He had this image that he talked about of morning. The sun comes up over the horizon, it passes across the sky, and it's straight overhead at midday, and evening it's setting, and all the way down it's night. And he saw the two horizons as birth and death, and the life in between as the stages of the life cycle. So there's rising of the sun, just the morning sunrise is the birth. And then a little bit later in the morning is the childhood. And a little bit later in the morning, late morning, is time for the puberty rites, to help young girls and boys let go of some of their childish ways and step up to the opportunity to become contributing adult members of the community or the tribe, of the people, and be in service of the people. And beyond that, we see in modern societies, there's an additional transition around early 20s. It's into the workforce, into the professions. There's university training, this sort of thing. But people have to get themselves anchored in some type of work or career track, so they can make money, so they can have a home, so they can get married, so they have the resources to raise children, and so on. And this phase can go on for a decade or more. As one arrives between the ages of 35 and 40, there's usually some period of discontent, according to Jung. And the values one's been committed to are largely social and serve the persona field. They have to do with your own achievement and success and social respect and people approving of you and being glad for your successes and so on. And people tend to identify with, this is who I am. But by midlife, as Jung himself discovered, these things start to feel unsatisfying, even flat or hollow. So it's the energy is running down again, and it's time for renewal at midlife. And a lot of people have not just midlife transitions, but crises at midlife. This is where divorces are likely to happen, or a job change, a complete career change, or a change in one's life path. One may be materialistic and suddenly become quite spiritual. So it's a major transition point. And then there's, the sun goes further down, there's, late afternoon, which is like late midlife. And there one really has the sense, if there's anything you need to give to your community or your descendants, your posterity, you better get on with it, because time is running short and you don't know how long you have to live, and you may get sick or die from an accident. So time is of the essence. Let's get it done. Let's get that book out there. let's spend time with our grandchildren, whatever form it takes. There's more of a sense of urgency in late midlife. And then by 70, let's say later in the evening, where it's sun's starting to set, we have the threshold of old age. And with this comes the awareness that a lot of people in their 70s are just dropping dead, or the sicknesses, the diseases are coming in, and their life is diminished, and eventually they will die. And so this is the phase of preparing for your death, to build your ship of death, so to speak, to develop your concepts and your understandings around death and the transition of death, which is the final point on the horizon. But also, this is a time really to become a wise old person, a grandmother or grandfather, as they say in the Amerindian traditions, where you actually are like a wise counselor and a supportive figure, and even a ritual elder for the younger generations. And this might not be just your grandchildren and great-grandchildren that you're caring for and looking out for, but also the immediate younger generations that may be in their 50s and 60s and 40s. They're looking to you now for some guidance of what lies ahead for them. And there's much you can do if you have individuated, or if you have done your initiation of each of these transition points of life. And the final one, it's good to have someone there, like a cycle pump, to help you shift to the other world, however you conceive that, and to die a good death. But it's hard to do that if you've not been coming to peace with your life at least by your 70s. So 70s is a time really to come to peace with the life you've lived, and at some point let go of ambition and just live into your 80s if you are fortunate, and live in the now, and love the birds and the cats and the morning sun, love your children, grandchildren, be here now in the present. And still, you are a source of radiance and wholeness and influence on the younger generations. So this basically is Jung's map for the transition points around which rites of passage are needed. And for him, the model he developed of Jungian analysis, this was essentially a framework in which people could actually have ongoing journeys into the other worlds, journeys to the center, and see what God is up to now, or what their daimonian or creative spirit wants of them now at this new stage of life with its new challenges. And I've known a number of Jungian analysts in their 70s and 80s that would call up their old analysts or friends and go sit and do a series of sessions with them just to do this work of getting the new vision, or getting a new insight as to what they can do now at the next stage of life. So life through these transition points, through the different stages of life, is another instance of energy running down at certain points. And at the transition points, you need to return to the center and plug into it and power up. And this is just a very important part of the individuation process, but also of the shamanist path of the heart. I have known a number of medicine men that took their vision quest and got a sense of who they really are and what their life purpose was when they were in their 20s or 30s. But as they got older, they started taking the same type of rites of passage, but they were called power quests, because now they were achieving new insights and new skills for the new stage of life they were facing. So they'd go off alone into the wilderness, which could be a forest, a desert, a cave, a mountaintop. I knew one Lakota medicine man that climbed higher on the same mountain each year, so he could get a more rarefied view of his life as he physically lifted himself higher and higher and closer to the Creator, or the Great Spirit, Wakantaka. But we can notice this energy running down. You can get enthusiastic about something at one point in your life, playing a game or collecting things, objects, and then one day you find the fire's gotten cool and you're not so interested in that. Think of two lovers that fall in love. When they first meet, maybe it's love at first sight, and there's like electricity running through their bodies, and they're so excited to be together and to meet each other. And the relationship continues, and they just can't see each other enough. They miss each other when they're not present to each other. Their hearts yearn and pine to be together. And when they are together, they just want to talk, and they want to play, and they want to make love. And they both admire each other. And if the story advances to the next stage, probably they will get married, or they will set up a housekeeping together. And that won't be quite as hot, but very satisfying. By the time the children come and the focus goes to that, and more energy flows into work and making money and paying the mortgage and trying to get out of debt. And in American society, both parents work, and so they're tired when they get home, and then they have the children to deal with. And there's just not enough time and energy to go around. And the relationship starts to cool down. And the couple don't know each other as they once did. Nobody's got any time to talk or admire each other and see how great the other person is, or to write them love letters. So the relationship also has its energetic cycle, and it's at these points where the energy is low that it's time for the couple to go back to the center, to the very heart of their relationship, and renew it, which can be done with a vacation, a weekend off together in another village or something, or by the seaside, but just alone. So if they have small children, they'll need a babysitter, they'll have to arrange it, they'll have to arrange the money. But you do need these times when you can reconstitute the very soul of the marriage, or the very soul of the relationship. And whatever that soul is, that's the center of your love relationship. And the clues are in how you met and how you were with each other in the beginning, and what kind of things you did with each other. There's a key there. And of course, there are practices like keeping a candle, a little altar just for your relationship in the bedroom, and lighting it and smudging with incense or something in the evening, and just hanging out in a loving way, admiring way, bringing comfort to each other, admiration, maybe a foot massage. Things like this can help rekindle and renew, because the center is each other. It's getting back into that engagement with each other that has the life in it. So this is the way it is with the journey to the center, the periodic return to the sacred. It's not just any center, it's the center. It orients you and it transforms you, and you cannot really transform without it. And that's why in all rites of initiation, there is the constitution of sacred space, some deep center in the circle that one must approach with due respect and plug into in order to die to the old way and be resurrected into new life. Now, having said something about the center, the sacred center, as transformative space-time, and about the archetype of initiation as having these three phases, it's important to say something about the community and the ritual elder. A ritual elder can be a shaman, can be a psychoanalyst, can be a civil rights leader for that matter, but it's somebody that knows how to constitute creative and sacred space and hold the boundaries firm so it doesn't become destructive, and keep you from just regressing and doing nothing on the one hand, and supporting you in facing what you fear the most to face, or what's most painful to deal with. Think of puberty rites in this context. These occur in the morning of, the late morning of life, when the the children are growing, their bodies are moving towards adulthood, and for the girls in a community, this becomes evident through menstruation. But the boys have no biological markers, but maybe their voice is changing, maybe they're getting more muscular, and they're naturally, biologically moving towards adult capabilities. But psychologically, they have to be transformed into an adult. It doesn't just happen by itself, and that's why initiation is so important. It's an archetype in itself that governs the transformation from one status or one way of being in the world to another. There's a certain kind of gravity that keeps us in our old patterns. And the rite of initiation, or the puberty rite or rite of passage, is designed to bring enough energy together in one space and hold it tightly in a firm container, a kind of alchemical vase or a protective womb space. And that requires the stewardship of one or more ritual elders. If it's just one individual undergoing the initiation, one ritual elder may be enough. But if you have a whole group of young girls or young boys that need to be initiated, then you need a community of women and men, respectively, who are elders or grandmothers and can help. Now, in the case of the girl who is being transformed into a woman, much does happen naturally in terms of the suffering. It marks a change. She starts to menstruate, and what is this blood about, and these cramps, and the suffering at this stage gives rise to an opportunity to initiate the young girl into womanhood by having her enter a secluded ritual space, perhaps a moon lodge, perhaps a sweat lodge, perhaps the hut or the home of some grandmother in the community, surrounded by a circle of other women elders who discuss the archetypal forces. They don't use that language, but the main forces that are being activated now at this transition point in the life cycle from girl to womanhood. And what is it to be a woman anyway? And what are the potentials and wonderful possibilities? And what does the woman want anyway? And what are the dangers? And what are the examples to live by as a young adult woman? Well, these come from the myths, the stories that have the archetypal figures who are heroes or ancestral role models that are shared. And through the telling of stories in this community context, the necessary support for activating the archetypes is put into place. And this is another way then of bringing in the sacred to activate the archetypes that need to come online next through telling the sacred histories called myths or stories. For the young boys who are to become men, they don't have the natural suffering of the moon, the menstrual cycle, and they certainly don't have that rhythmic pattern once a month, so to speak. And they are therefore taken from their mothers out into the wild. It can be the desert, a mountain, a forest, a cave, by a waterfall, but some powerful, secluded, very private space where the men are separated. And that's the first phase of the initiation. And of course, they're afraid, and their mothers are probably crying. At least they're acting like they're sad to lose their sons, and feel they'll never see their son again, this sort of thing. But there, the boy will be subjected to physical pain and suffering, ordeals such as having to do very difficult things like be strapped to an anthill in the bush country and suffer for hours, maybe all day in the sun, the bites of ants. or have their face scarified, as the Yoruba initiates undergo, or to have a tooth knocked out, as happens in some cultures, or to receive a certain kind of tattoo. These markers are biological. They are marks on the body. They cause pain when they're being applied, and this is one of the heroic ordeals the candidate has to undergo. He must know pain. He must transform with the pain. The whole thing about pain and suffering, to give it a Dostoevskian twist, Fyodor Dostoevsky, thinking of Crime and Punishment, and the way the hero of that story, Raskolnikov, who's just a horrible young man, murdering two women because he thinks he's superior and he deserves their money, so to speak. I truncate the story, but what redeems him is this other person, a woman, Sonia, who suffers deeply, and she has a compassionate heart, and it leads him to open his heart and to have a regeneration, a renewal, a rebooting, a restarting of his life after he's done prison time. So suffering has a capacity to transmute the soul, to transmute it, meaning to give it a new shape, a new form that is more mature, more whole, more creative, more compassionate. So one way or another, it's a marker of transitions and the outcome of a life crisis, if it is creatively resolved, will entail some ordeal of suffering. Anyway, in many cultures, there is a celebration after this period of ritual seclusion, and the girl, now woman, usually has a new name, and there may be a dance, first with the women of the community and then later with the whole village or something, and they get to knock the hats off of men and dance with who they choose. And when the boys come back, now men, they have different names. And the names often refer to their own guardian spirits and their life purpose within the community. But they have to introduce themselves. My name is, to their own mothers, for example, because something new has taken place. There is a transformation, and now this needs to be acknowledged by the community. So community is very important in rites of initiation. And on that note, when we get to Jung, we'll have something to say, because he really didn't have that in place when he underwent his initiation for a variety of reasons. But there is a spontaneous form of initiation, or one that originates from the guardian spirit of an individual. And all humans have a guardian spirit, a guardian angel, a totem animal, whatever you want to call that. It's some celestial twin, higher self that carries your purpose, looks out for you, has to do with providence or protection and synchronicity in your life, and speaks to you in your dreams, in your heart's desire, speaks to you with silent knowledge, the kind of Zen-like just knowing intuitively. Everybody has one of those, and the shaman's crisis comes about through spontaneous awakening of you out of a state of slumber with regard to your guardian spirit or daimonion or angel. And it can cause quite a bit of upheaval. But for some rare individuals, rare even amongst shamans, the inner spirits, whether they be in the form of an ancestor or an animal helper or just a supernatural guardian spirit, it will reveal itself as a guide. And the candidate, the one undergoing the crisis, will need to ask it, what do you want from me? What am I to do? Maybe it's already been in quest of that, but maybe it's just because of the crisis it now says, who are you and who am I and what am I to do with my life? Or how do I survive this illness? How do I heal myself? what is my purpose for being here? Life seems very challenging and difficult, and it's these kind of questions. And some individuals seem to be able to create their own ritual seclusion and have the psychological integrity and ego strength to enter into a dialogical relationship with the guardian spirit or the ancestor who's awakening them. But Jung was an example of that type. It was brought about, the catalyst was his break with Freud, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it was his grief and disappointment and the embarrassment of the social world collapsing around him. So he had to see that he needed to separate from the social world and from the persona field and go deep within. In my case, it was a little different. My initiation happened like this. For some time in my early 30s, I was seeing this large wing spread. I came to eventually see was a thunderbird, but its wings could stretch 30, 40 feet wide. And it was always kind of hovering up in the tree shadows at night when I would take walks on the streets of the village that I lived in. And then one night, it's hovering over me, and this big oak tree across the street from my home turns into a magic tree. I don't know what else to call it but that. It really becomes alive, and rather than leaves on the tree, there's this giant dragon-sized serpent spiraling around in the branches, and its multicolored mosaic of a body was just breathtaking. And after a while, as days went by, without any effort at all, I would always see that magic tree. And I would always see this thunderbird hovering above me. And I remember mentioning it to my wife, and she wondered what I was talking about. And I was surprised because I kind of thought everybody else could see this stuff too. But no, so that was a bit of a shock. And after that shock, I was driving to my office one day, and while driving, the road just exploded. It opened up, and my car plunged into an infinite abyss, and there were all kinds of numinous totems and spirits, ancestors, hovering in the different depths, and it was all I could do to remind myself I am driving my car rather quickly, and I must come out of it. But I was fascinated. And I realized this is not a good situation to put my life at risk and maybe others at risk while driving. With this, I decided to get back into Jungian analysis. I had been a few years before with my analyst, Helen Luke, but there was another Jungian analyst that lived nearby, Tom Kapuscinskis, and I gave him a call and started sessions again with him. And I think the second or the third session, I know what this is. This is a shamanic awakening, and you need a medicine man. You need to get with somebody that knows how to work with this. And so I went looking. It took some time. I did find that, and I started being taught basic ceremonies like the principles of the medicine wheel, how to create a sacred fire, and to pray, and to connect, and eventually how to journey, to go on a voyage, to intentionally connect with the guardian spirit and see what it was up to. And I started to get this under control. I didn't need to just break into my world when I'm driving or doing something, but that I could set rules and limitations on it. Have time to work and fulfill my obligations as a man, as a human, as a young psychotherapist that I was. And over time, I was led to go out on a vision quest in northern Canada on Lake Temagami, which is in the Hudson Bay area or near there. And I was out there 2 weeks. completely cut off from society. I was flown in by an airplane that landed on the water and dropped me off and said, we'll be back in 2 weeks. And there I went to a number of sweat lodges with a medicine man and fasting, and learned to navigate the waters in a Voyager canoe and find an island there somewhere in Lake Temagami where I could be alone for several days and nights. And I did that. And in that vision quest, while I had many visions, that was not the vision I was seeking. The vision of a vision quest is the insight into your life, because the questions are, who am I? What's going on? What do you want from me? What am I supposed to be doing with my life? What am I here for? These are the questions. I knew, as any initiate knows, they're not just here to eat, drink, and be merry. They're not just here to be healed. They're here for something. And that for something has to do with the human community and the whole planet, Mother Earth, and so on. So that's what I was in quest of. And by the end of the quest, it was very clear to me this stone I was sitting by, like a lapis lazuli, had beautiful colors when I put water over it. Felt so solid. I called it my heart stone. And I said to myself, this is who I am. I am that stone. Jung said something like that too, the stone. But I said, I am that stone because I am my heart. I live from my heart. I express my heart. And I shall help other people. That's what I'm here for. Help other people connect with their own solid stone nature, with their own heart. And from that day to this, nearly 4 decades later, I am still doing this work that I was called to do. Although there's been changes as the seasons of my life change as to how I express it, what methods I use. Because one gets better at some things as one gets older. Or one has less physical strength and so has to change. So I've changed with the different transition points in my life. But still, I am fulfilling my destiny, my mission in life that was clarified on that vision quest. I came back, I met with a community, I met with a medicine man, shared my stories. He helped prepare me to go back into life and see what lay ahead for me. During the vision quest, I saw that I needed to go back to school. I went back to school, got 2 doctorates, and specialized in clinical psychology and medical anthropology, and at the same time enrolled at the Jung Institute and graduated with a diploma in analytical psychology. At the same time, I had great energy for it because I knew I had to reorganize my life, because prior to my awakening with the Thunderbird, I was living a life that was pretty egocentric. It was based on my own achievements, my success, how brilliant a therapist I was, yada, yada. It was all about ego and persona and how people perceived me. But all that began to shift with this rite of initiation. Now, that being out there in the sweat lodges, in the vision quests, those were not the only moments of my descent into the underworld, the other world. For I was an analyst too, so I had a knowledgeable ritual elder, Tom Kapuscinskis, there to hold space and contain. Because you can get into dangers. As you get close to the sacred, you are getting close to the archetypal self, or the absolute essence of your being. And it can be a regressive experience, or it can be an inflating experience. Many people don't want to leave the womb or leave the cave of initiation. So the shaman or the elder's got to kind of boot them out, push them out, because they have work to do. They have to activate their capacities to do it and get out there and do it. Otherwise, they're failed initiations. Another big danger is not regression, but inflation. With inflation, as you get close to the center or the self, It's easy to think you are somebody special, somebody really big or important, and you're ready to be a master or teacher or whatever. And this is just utter nonsense. It can happen naturally enough, but you need tools to help you keep humble and to keep a relationship between the ego or the I and this larger self, which seems to be infinite in size and depth, but you are not that. You are its companion. Its job is to help you individuate, help you fulfill your destiny. That's how it individuates. Its purpose is to creatively help you and me to evolve, develop, transform, and it gets to enjoy that. And at the same time, we do evolve, transform, individuate because of its help. Now, this is exactly what was going on for Jung, too, as we will see. His own guardian spirit, or creative daimonion, was Philemon, although he met many other characters. It's Philemon that ultimately revealed itself, pretty much as the author of the entire Red Book, orchestrating all the other characters that were in there. And we'll shift now to that point, but just let me finish by saying that the depth psychotherapist, the Jungian analysts are also initiatory masters. They are elders, and their job is to hold space, to keep you from regressing, to keep you unnecessarily, and to keep you from inflation, and to hold the vessel of the therapeutic relationship tight. It has to be hot enough for you to cook alchemically and transform. It therefore can't be too cool. But it can't be so hot that you light up like a Christmas tree and go crazy, which is often a big fear one has in shamanic initiations, is maybe what I'm doing is madness, is psychosis. So your Jungian psychoanalyst or your medicine man supervisor is someone whose job is to be aware of the quality of the sacred transformative space that you need to do this inner work. And so I had many, for me it was weekly analytic sessions where I'm returning to the underworld, not just looking at my dreams, but sharing my active imaginations, and also getting input and guidance from a human. In my opinion, it's wisest and best not to go Jung's path completely without some other elder. And Jung himself actually had his wife, with her wealth and her taking care of the children, to run a solid household, so Jung didn't have to worry about that. Jung had patience. He still kept his analytic appointments daily. And he had his companion, Tony Wolff, who had a nature similar to his and mirrored him and gave him feedback and so on. So he did have a little tribe there that supported him. Plus, he read the great classical literature, Goethe, his Faust, Nietzsche's Zarathustra. But he also read the classical literature, from Virgil's Aeneid and the Nekia into the underworld there, and Odysseus's journey into the land of the dead, and he read his Dante, the whole Commedia, and he used these great mythopoetic works of art to support him. They were like a framework, as if he had an analyst there lifting up these archetypal themes in world mythology and say, here's what's going on. Here's what you're after. This is kind of how you map it out and understand it. And this helps one to feel like one is not going crazy. But at the same time, shamanic initiation, at least, and I think an individuative initiation is not just about you. It's about the whole world that you're living in. And Jung was living in a crisis point before World War I, and he didn't know until he knew that it wasn't just him who was feeling crazy inside. Europe was feeling crazy and was ready to explode into a contagion and then into murderous, violent warfare. And when Jung had this realization, it was a great relief and helped him to feel, no, I'm not going crazy. I'm feeling the condition of the world. And it was a world in which the sacred had been lost. Sure, there were churchgoers, but that was being pushed into irrelevance with the gains of reason and science and technology and the Industrial Revolution. It becomes something tame compared to what it is in traditional societies and indigenous cultures. And Jung couldn't believe in Orthodox Christianity, and even his father couldn't believe in Orthodox Christianity. And his father was depressed because of it, and he was weak, and he did not have the resources like Jung did to work his way through it. And then he dies early and leaves Jung kind of bitter and looking for another father figure, whom he does find eventually in Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud becomes the personification of the positive side of Jung's father complex. Here's a man who has his own faith. It's not in religion, it's in the science of psychoanalysis, but he has a strong voice, he has a clear understanding, he's helping people. And of course, Jung identified with that. And Freud himself had a need for a son. He didn't have a son. He needed an heir apparent, someone to carry on his great movement so it would survive. And he saw Jung as that figure. But as fate would have it, Jung was very different in his character than Freud. And his predilections and inclinations were quite different. Jung was always drawn to the mystical and the mythological and the occult and the paranormal, this sort of thing that Freud could not tolerate. That was his rationalism. And Jung thought Freud's ideas were too sexually based and that the libido was psychic energy, not sexual energy, and that pleasure a baby gets suckling at its mother's breast is not sexual. It's the joy and the pleasure anybody gets from having a good meal. This was the difference between the two men. And Jung published that, Jung lectured on that, and that along with his Symbols of Transformation book, Symbol the Wandelungen, the relationship with Freud broke. So he lost Father Freud. He lost his divine sonship. And he didn't know who he was then. Basically, he didn't know his psychology. He knew Freud's very well, and he knew its limitations, but he did not know what his own psychology was. He didn't know what his own religion was. It's not the religion of his father. It's not Freud's belief system. So he asked himself, by what myth am I living? And he found he didn't know. And so this was the task, the reason why he had a yearning to plunge into the unconscious depths. For him, it was actually a plunge into the mythic underworld and into the land of the dead. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to give you a detailed description of the Red Book because that's the book where the initiation is articulated so beautifully. But I cannot do it because just to skim the surface of that, it would take hours, if not days, and I'm limited here to finishing within an hour. So I've selected this topic of the archetype of initiation so we can see how it worked in Jung's life and perhaps how it can work on our own. And an important point to note was that Jung was not satisfied with the analysis of dreams. He felt it was too passive. And he had colleagues were exploring auto-hypnosis, automatic writing, crystal gazing to try to open a portal for the unconscious to bubble up and come through. But Jung wanted an active method. And he saw in the mythologies of these great Nekiyas that he read how there can be a quite interactive process just as there is with shamans and their journeys to the other worlds and to the ancestors and so on. So Jung developed a method similar to the shamanic journey. He didn't have drums and rattles and that sort of thing, so far as we know. And he probably didn't do mescaline, as some people suspected, because one can do this on one's own if one knows how to journey. And he developed a method by which his I, or his ego consciousness, his ego personality, could loosen and surrender, but maintain its position at the same time, and enter into a dialogue with the other. And so he imagined a portal, he says, a kind of a hole in the ground or an abyss or a cavern that he would just drop into, fall into. And he would just focus on that for some time, the falling, the going down, kind of like a hypnotic induction, self-hypnotic induction, where he just can feel the deeper and deeper depths. And then he'd land somewhere between a cave with a rock and a river under it, and a hot desert that he'd run across and into some rocky mountains and find an anchorite or hermit living there and spend days living with him and eating with him and discussing his readings and this sort of thing. These are quite detailed journeys that he took. And then he, when he was finished with the journey, would document very carefully in his black books what actually happened and occurred. And any reflections and any sharings from Tony Wolff or other friends that he cared to share his experiences with, he might jot down those insights there. So he was taking this process of journeying in the underworld and then integrating it in some sense, holding it in these black books, and eventually assembling it as best he could into the beautifully, artfully done Red Book. He was showing it due respect. And he developed a kind of magical theurgy, a form of worship and prayer that is what his active imagination was. And he starts out like St. Augustine, calling out to God. He says, "My soul, where are you?" And he says it was the spirit of the depths that led him to the depths and led him to call on his soul. And later we'll find out at the end of the book in the scrutinies, he says he had this realization or the suspicion that it was Philemon all along the way. But he says, "My soul, are you there? Can you hear me?" And then it started to speak. And when it spoke to Jung's illusions, for he's looking to soul in all the wrong places, primarily external to himself, outside himself. You can think of figures like how important Father Freud was to him, how important his Jungian or his psychoanalytic colleagues were to him, how important his status and success was. He saw that he had all the pleasures a man could hope for in the first half of life. He had wealth, fame, achieved success, was honored with honorary doctorates, had published significant contributions to psychiatry of his day. But nothing so original as what was about to come. At any rate, his soul helped him to see that these were not really important now. At this transition point, at this stage of life, now it was about getting to know his own soul in depth and what he's here for and what his religion is, what his myth is. And he contrasted the spirit of the depths, which led him or guided him, and whom I said I think was Philemon. He contrasted it with the spirit of the times. The spirit of the times is the zeitgeist, the spirit of the social world, the what's important, making money, being somebody, being a success. And all this was challenged, and I think ruthlessly so. He had to look at all the games he played, the lies he told himself. And this is the kind of stuff of shamanic initiation and recapitulation and learning to accept who one really is and not the false self that we've constructed for the world, or the persona, as he called the false self. It's supposed to be some type of role that you use, but he was identified with it, and now it's stripped away. He's lost that, and he's on his own resources now to discover who he really is. And in the process of doing this, he had a number of encounters with these archetypal figures. I could call them archetypal images. At that time, I think his term, a primordial image, works best for a god or other mythical being like a daimon or an ancestor in mythology. He was having real conversations with figures like this, and there was quite a few of them. In addition to his soul, there was the god Izdubar, there was an anchorite, there was a professor. Eventually, he got something like an Old Testament prophet Elijah, who comes along with Salome, who's blind and got a serpent dancing along with her, following her everywhere she goes. And there's one scene there where he's talking to Elijah, and he's looking up on this hill, and he sees Christ being crucified, and out comes Salome, with the serpent following her, and Jung goes up the hill, and the next thing he knows, he's the one on the cross, and the serpent is wrapping around his legs, and his head becomes a lion head, and he becomes transformed into the god Ion. And this kind of transformation in shamanism is not a possession, but a merger, an experience of one's divinity or of the particular entity of the spirit that one is merging with, so that one feels that divinity or that spiritual quality. And then, of course, Jung came out of that, and on he goes. Eventually, Philemon and Salome morph into, or I should say Elijah and Salome morph into Philemon, which becomes Jung's true guardian spirit, his daimonion. And in the Greek literature, that word is used a lot. And sometimes it just means whenever a god or an archetypal figure is guiding you in some way, that's a daimon. D-A-I-M-O-N, if I spell it in English, or delta, alpha, iota, mu, omega, nu in Greek. But the word daimonion means your individual guide, your individual source of inspiration and protection. So that's what he had in Philemon. And when he initially appears, he comes in on the sky. He's got the horns of a bull and the wings of a kingfisher. And he's a beautiful figure. And Jung does a couple paintings of him. And I believe I heard he's even in the Bullingen Tower upstairs in his bedroom painted this figure spread out on the ceiling. Philemon then becomes the central character. The others aren't so important. And for the rest of Jung's life, Philemon is the major figure. And we don't hear much about Elijah and the anchorite and Izdubar and so on. They are left in the past because if you think of the guardian spirit as the archetypal self, your center in totality, and as the dream maker, the source of inspiration that regulates and integrates or tries to hold the opposite parts of yourself together, the opposite archetypal facets and attitudes. You can see the whole pantheon of figures that Jung encountered in the Red Book as under the leadership of Philemon. And Jung comes to understand that. He says it twice towards the end of the Red Book in the scrutiny section, almost at the end of the scrutinies, that he could suspect now that it was Philemon right from the very beginning. And I read that as right from the spirit of the depths who leads him into the depths and wanted him to go down so he could discover who he really is, what he really is, and where he comes from, and what he's to do with his life. And towards the end of the Red Book, in the scrutinies, Philemon is spewing wisdom and inspiration. He is preaching to the dead who've come back to Jerusalem. There was some point in the book where the dead, they're the unquiet dead. They're not really ancestors. They're the unquiet dead, meaning they're people like his father that lost their faith. And Jung sent them off to Jerusalem or something to see if they could find what they were seeking there. And they came back and they knocked on his door of his house, he said, or rang his bell, and they wanted in, and Jung sat down to write. And ultimately, Jung saw that that was Philemon and acknowledged that. And the significance of this is Jung is the scribe, so to speak. Philemon is like the Holy Spirit, and the Red Book is like the Bible. In the scrutinies, Philemon is inspiring Jung with his own psychology. The psychology Jung is going to spend the rest of his life translating into psychological terms, because here it's in mystical and shamanistic and mythological language, gods, the god, daimons, and daimonions, and anchorites, and hermits, and prophets, and so on, visions, deaths, and rebirths, and all that is translated into concepts like archetypes. His devils or demons become autonomous complexes that are causing trouble. And the guardian spirit, or the daimonion itself, becomes the archetypal self, the capital S self. That's the center and the circumference of the whole personality system of the individual psyche. And Jung would spend the rest of his life elaborating that through many, many books and through many lectures and seminars and some travels and delivering that. And he ended up even elaborating it further through alchemy and its poetic imagery, of the Negredo, the Philosopher's Stone, the Master Confuser, Prima Materia. All those concepts became a language, a poetic language, by which to articulate his psychology, that he first sat down in those terms like complex, archetype, the self, the ego, and so on. But immediately after, Jung was giving attention to his dreams and was painting mandalas, and he had the famous Liverpool dream, and in that he's moving from the outskirts of a city towards this golden light in the center, and he follows the streets, across a canal, and he gets into the center, and it's this beautiful tree that's lit up. And he realized he was at the center, he said, and you cannot go beyond the center. So from that moment, Jung had crystallized what the individuation process was about. It was about realization in your life at every stage of the self, which is the center and totality. And that's his psychological transformation for saying that the guardian spirit, your version of Philemon, should be the guide and companion, the dialogue partner of your life. It will constantly speak to you through dreams, through intuitions, through synchronicities. So you had best give attention to it, prayerful, devotional attention. And paint your visions or paint your prayers. Write and calligraph like he did in the Red Book. And as he thought, you will create a little cathedral for yourself that you can open and sit down with, and you have your own church, your own private religion. And we just must make a comment about the beautiful tower on Lake Bowling in itself, where Jung increasingly spent more years of his life and carved his dreams and visions and painted them and tended old fires, cooked over an open fire, had no electricity, drew his own water, played at the water's edge, and continually was inspired by the natural setting, by the ghosts of the land, and it doesn't say it much, but I believe his conversations with Philemon that run with him all the way through his late alchemical works. So we have a model of a private religion. Jung found his own religion, which at the same time is his own mythology, which at the same time supports his unique individuality and has given him a purpose so important in the 20th century that here we sit in the 21st century talking about it tonight. And that there are thousands of Jungian analysts now all over the world, and there are thousands of books on Jungian psychology, and it's evolving into new areas, and this is just wonderful. This whole thing about the archetype of initiation, which I've been illustrating throughout my talk, has to do with our moving into a crisis. Usually there's a loss. And we are living now in a time of crisis globally, with global warming, with environmental disaster, with fascism on the rise, with warfare, all kinds of social unrest, and confusing array of religious pluralisms. What are we going to do with all this? We need knowledgeable ritual elders. And that can include psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, Jungian analysts, but it can also include the artists, the poets, as it always has, and the comedians. I mean, the ones that get us to laugh by sharing the painful truth. Writers of all kinds, painters, musicians, theater people. Each can become, if they'll mature into it, a ritual elder and guide the subsequent generations for the sake of the future, for the sake of our children and our grandchildren's great-grandchildren on down the line, to help this world continue in its beauty as something that's still worth being in, living in, contributing to. It requires initiation. Otherwise, we fall back on our ordinary consciousness, our selfish ego, centricity, and our species will perish from its sheer shadow foolishness. Thank you for listening.